저기 적혀 있어. 와이파이를 기억하지 않게 소개를
할 수 없어. 아무튼 할 수 없어. 이게 미국까지 파는 거예요. 미국은 나도 가만히 있었던 시죠. 나는 이게 언제나 안 될 것 같다는 생각이 들어요. 15분에서 지금까지 괜찮은 우리 언제나 깨질 거라는 생각이 들어요. 이해할 수 없다면 옛날에는 미국이 그런 거 좀 있었어요. 정말 거기가 한국 중심으로 여행사 이일제대로 없애자고 했었거든. 저희 다 주합에서 그게 없죠. 그걸 감수한 것이 이게 그거는 이게 너가 있을 거야. 조지 워싱턴도 있었고, 토마스 제퍼슨도 있었고.
도착했대네. 수고들 많아요.
엄청난 문제가 된다니까. 잘못하면 고치는 거 끝까지 할 수 있는 거야. GSIS. 그러면 생각보다 알려주는 거라서 60년대부터 컴퓨터하고 문화컴퓨터하고 90년대 자본 피스트리까지 그리고 정서를 만들려고 했어서 그런데 이게 안 되면 우리가 우선 인내심으로 똑같으면 이렇게 맞지 이렇게 시작했기 때문에 미국은 문제가 미국은 그걸 다 쓸 수가 없어. 때문에 이게 미국만의 그러니까 65년을 전화 결정해서 미국은 사실은 빠지라는 거야.
Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to CSIS-KU GSIS roundtable. I apologize. I don't have to apologize. On behalf of Victor Cha for being late. As you know, thanks for coming despite the high vacation season to this very interesting meeting. We have very special guests today from CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is world-class think tank. They are US-Korea next generation scholars. Here the key word is next generation. Okay? Being a next generation means they are fresh-minded, they are armed with new technology and new methodologies, and most importantly, they are ready to, or getting ready to replace old generations like Victor and like some. I'm kidding. Okay. Anyway, they are here finally, and I look forward to your active participation. I think after this, their own respective presentation. Let me introduce Dr. Victor Cha, who is my 2-decade-old friend, and he serves as a Korea chair at the CSIS, and also is a professor of international relations at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. Please welcome.
Thank you, Sanam, for that introduction. I am a professor at Georgetown, but I have a new job starting the following week at University in Georgetown, so I'm never going to do research for the next 3 years. But I want to thank Professor Kim Sung-han and his colleagues for organizing this session. It's just an incredible turnout for the middle of the summer. I really do appreciate it and apologize NextGen Scholar Program is a program that is now in its 6th year. It is co-run by CSIS and the University of Southern California Korea Studies Institute. As we speak now, the other half of our NextGen class is at Seoul National University doing exactly the same thing, although they probably got there on time because we had much further to go from where our first meeting was. The NextGen scholars, as Sana mentioned, are academics that are all really in the beginning of their career in the academy. We do a competition, an international competition, where we invite scholars to apply, and then for this class we picked 10. Thankfully, they all said yes. They are all, as you will see, people from very different fields. They're not all, some of them are political scientists, some of them are not political scientists, some of them work specifically on Korea, some people, only part of their work is focused on Korea. But in many of these cases, they are the only person who does any work remotely related to Korea at their university, in the city in which their university resides, in the state in which their university resides, and maybe in that entire time zone. They may be the only person working in Korea. In which case, if there is news on Korea, and there is always news on Korea, the local NPR station, the local radio station, the university will want to talk to someone in Korea, and it usually ends up being one of these people. So while part of our program is to encourage them to do their research, we have an academic mentoring part of this that is designed to try to help them navigate path tenure. The other part of that is to help them become better public policy scholars, in addition to their research. And so the way we do that is we do 3 meetings. The first meeting was in Washington, D.C. last winter, where we brought the scholars to Washington and we took them to various places to meet policymakers. So they were at the White House, they were at the State Department, intelligence agencies, Capitol Hill. Then the second meeting took place this past spring in Los Angeles at USC, where we had them work with journalists on how to write an op-ed, write a piece, and then also with the Edwards School of Communications, how to do television, how to do media interviews on television. The last and the most important part of the trip is to Korea this summer, where they met a number of officials. We will go to the Blue House this afternoon. They were at the U.S. Embassy yesterday, the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the Beautification Ministry. They had dinner with Korean journalists. And tonight they have dinner with the senior advisors to the project, which include people like Kim Sung-han and Lee Sing-hwa, and other academics, so that senior academics here in Korea, that sort of thought leaders here in Korea, can also so that's, in a nutshell, the program. We're very proud of our NextGen scholars. This is the 3rd class of NextGen scholars. We tell each class they're the best class. This class is the best class of NextGen scholars. And I thought, if it's okay, sometimes what we do is have them each say a little bit about themselves and the sort of research they're doing, and then we'll just open up for discussion. Yeah, so thank you all for coming, and then the scholars will introduce themselves to you, and then we can discuss.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Let me moderate the roundtable session. If you look at the agenda, the brilliant bio of those 5 NextGen scholars are there. So you may refer to those bios, which means I'm not going to read their bios. So without further ado, let me start the round table from Catherine Fraser-Cox, who will be briefly introducing herself and then explain about your topic for about 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
No, very good.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, and thank you for hosting us here today and for your attention. There are other things we'll be doing on this very sunny day, not raining. We're all very happy to be here as well. I'm Dr. Katz, and I'm currently an adjunct fellow at CSIS, but based in New York. So this year I'll be teaching at Columbia University. And so I'm happy to share a little bit about my recent research. I don't want to go into too much detail because I'll leave it, any questions or things you're interested in hearing more about in the Q&A. But I'll try to give a kind of an overview of the things I've been thinking about and then look forward to hearing from you. So at the broadest level, I've been looking at conflict patterns in Northeast Asia, the periodic rise and fall in tensions, nationalist charged issues that we all know well about in this room. It's a quite unique pattern that has its own name, hot economics, cold politics. The reason I've honed in on this, and empirically in my dissertation work I look at the island disputes, but I'm really interested more generally in a number of sensitive topics that can kick off these episodes of contention. The reason I focused on these issues is for two reasons. One, academically, prominent IR theories don't explain them very well. Some very well-known kind of intuitive theories like the commercial piece, the idea that economic partners should get along well. That helps to explain why these disputes don't escalate to war, but it doesn't explain why they escalate at all among the key economic partners in the region. Secondly, theories about nationalism, the conventional wisdom around nationalism is that if leaders kick up nationalism, their hands are going to be tied by now. They're going to have a very hard time de-escalating tensions. And so the patterns in this region confound that because they show that there's, at least so far, been kind of a lid to tensions in these disputes in the region. So as someone kind of from an academic perspective, looking at these patterns that have been quite regular in recent decades, considering that this is one of the regions with some of the world's largest economies and militaries, I think the academic field of IR can do better in explaining these patterns. And so from an academic perspective, that's what brought me here. But I also have a previous policy background and experience in the policy world, maybe the reverse order of most folks, but I did some posts in DC that brought me really to pursue PhD studies. And from a policy perspective, when I worked on some of these issues at the NSC in particular, what was concerning was that the rise and fall in tensions is so regular that you can become somewhat complacent and see like in DC where what comes up is going to come down. And in fact, that's been pretty much the case. The U.S. has been tries to be pretty hands-off, has gotten involved at certain key moments, I think in a good way, in a helpful way. But the general idea is that time will do its healing work. I'm quoting actually a scholar in some newspaper article that I thought captured the general sense that if you get involved, you might make things worse, and over time things should get better. So just don't get involved. So the problem from that is that the world changes and dispute patterns change, and that if that is our understanding of disputes from a Washington policy perspective, then someone in DC might not know when to worry and when to really engage, because the interests at stake for the U.S. in this region are too important to not get engaged if we have more trouble patterns going on. Unfortunately, I think we're in one of those moments right now in Japan-Korea relations where we should be worried. Where dispute patterns are changing. And I think that it's too early for me to say how they're changing. But I think it's clear to everyone in this room who's well aware of what I'm talking about with Japan and Korea, that things are changing. And so it's important, if there's any value add that my work can have for policymakers, maybe it'll come too late. It would be in trying to discern where we came from and what exactly is changing now, and therefore what we can do to get things back on track. So that's just the broad sweep and overview of what brought me to this topic from both an academic and policy perspective. In my work, in my dissertation, which I'm now hoping to make into a book, I generated theory, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but generally I focus more on the domestic group aspects of these disputes, looking at which groups are involved in both the escalation and de-escalation phase of of episodes of contention, both between Japan and Korea and Japan and China. So I won't go into that too much here, but that's been the empirical focus of my work, moving away from looking at broader structural patterns and ideational issues, which are also important, but honing in on domestic group dynamics involved. So just a few key takeaways and observations from my work that might be relevant to the present moment I'll share, and then I'll let my colleagues decide to talk about their more interesting research. So a few things that might be useful today. One thing that's clear right now is that business interests are involved in the escalation phase of this episode of contention between Japan and Korea, really for the first time in a real way. So previous episodes between Japan and Korea on issues like Dokdo Islands and other contentious history issues have mostly involved symbolic issues in the escalation phase. Important symbolic issues, one that the publics care deeply about and should care deeply about, but symbolic and collective, which the mobilization dynamics of collective issues, if you will, some of the action problem, these are quite different than when private interests are involved. So they do tend to fizzle out more over time because of the free rider problem in these areas. So generally, symbolic interests have been on the side of escalation in the past, and that's been helpful in the de-escalation phase for leaders because they've been able to generate symbolic concessions to tamp down tensions. Not concessions that make the issues go away, but things like stopping or putting a near-term end to Yasukuni visits. Doesn't cost the Japanese leaders something in terms of maybe help politically, but not materially economically. And symbolic concessions can be useful because both sides they're sometimes vague enough that both sides can kind of frame them in a way that provides a facing and rationale for the publics to back down. So we're now in a space where economic issues are in the escalation phase. It's harder to de-escalate an economic issue because it's very clear who loses and it's measurable who loses. But there might be space in some way. I hope if we can buy some time here. I know today was a pretty troubling day in terms of things escalating more. But thinking about what type of a symbolic issue, a symbolic trait might work would be something to think about. Again, from my research, I don't know how that would work, but it's something to think about, decompressing the very concrete issues that are involved now. That my concern is that the nationalist theories that I talked about, the leaders' hands being tied, that we go more into that space where their hands are tied and they're really locked in. So one thought from my research and looking at the conflict patterns is that going back to symbolic concessions might be a useful thing if we have time. I mean, things are moving so fast right now, and the implications are already compounding in terms of this escalation. But that's one thought. The second is that the quiet forces of business interests, export-oriented conglomerates, and so forth, have played a quiet role in de-escalating these disputes in the past. And once economic interests are affected, leaders have found a way to de-escalate. That's different now because we already have economic costs involved. But my sense is that business interests remain on the side of cooperation, that they don't want to feel the pain of these escalations in either Japan or Korea. And that goes for the US and international interests that are going to be affected as well. So the takeaway from that is that I don't think business interests ever have an interest in being very vocal and out front and prescribing policy. Their interests are in their bottom line of profits. But to have that they remain, I hope, an important force in communicating through government channels and with each other across countries, and also if they're going to have a public role, it's in articulating the costs here, so that the broader publics do understand. I think South Koreans well understand the implications of the export controls. I know watching news in recent days, it's very clear. But within the Japanese public as well, within the US public as well, again, to alert people that this is a time to work, particularly I'm talking about in the United States in particular. I think that'll become clear maybe before when it's too late, when we're already seeing the outcomes in terms of increased prices from these work supply chains through these new export control restrictions. Anyway, I will leave it there. I do have some ideas about things that the U.S. could do to get more involved as well. That's what my research, but I don't know.
Thank you, Catherine.
And our next speaker is Stephanie Kim, personal.
Thank you, Jean Kim, and thank you to the staff and to everyone here at Korea University for welcoming us this afternoon. So my name is Stephanie Kim, and I'm a faculty member at Georgetown University, where I direct a master's program in higher education administration. And so I'm certainly by no means the sole Korean studies person in my institution or let alone my city. I have the unenviable position of sharing the stage with Professor Chong at Georgetown University. But nonetheless, I approach the study of Korea perhaps from a different and somewhat novel angle than some of my colleagues here, because my background is in education, and I am very much interested in issues of higher education. So my research sits at the intersection of higher education and migration studies. And so typically, migration studies has been framed typically in political and economic lenses. So we've seen a lot of studies on labor mobility, on refugees, etc. But recently, there's been an interest in understanding migration through an education lens. Specifically looking at the movement of students, mostly those who move from south to north or from east to west in pursuit of academic credentials and professional opportunities. And this discussion is primarily understood at the scale of the individual. So the individual aspirations of students that then drive them to pursue education overseas, or it's primarily understood at the scale of the nation state. So government policies that shape the movement of students and allow for their movement. But what's sorely missing from this discussion is the role of the institutions. So that is the universities themselves and how those universities exercise various forms of agency as they themselves face domestic challenges and look to global opportunities in response. So primarily the aggressive recruitment of students from overseas. And that's where my own research comes in. And so I look at higher education reforms happening in both South Korea and the United States. From a US perspective, I look at how US universities are facing budget cuts and look to international students to make up for these revenue shortfalls, international students who primarily come from Asian countries. And I'm sure many of you in this room might have had some study abroad opportunities in the United States. And I also look at how Korean universities are facing domestic demographic shifts, primarily from the low birth rate, but also from the vast numbers of Korean students who go overseas, and how these universities negotiate these challenges through specific institutional reforms, initiatives, and programs. And so this is essentially the topic of the book project that I am currently writing now, tentatively titled From Berkeley to Seoul, How Higher Education Travels Across the World. And the book project looks at the movement of Korean students between South Korea and the United States to uncover the institutional mechanisms that allow for their movement in the first place. And it's framed under the thematic of traveling students, but really I look at how institutional competition travels across national borders, and that is the crux of the book. I'm happy to discuss a little bit more during the Q&A, but for purposes of time, I will keep it short and end it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And our next speaker is Jiyoung Ko at the BaseCon.
Hello everyone. Thank you for having us today, here today. So I'm an assistant professor at Bates College in Maine, so I think I'm the only Korean expert in Maine actually. And I'm a Korean University alumni, so I'm really happy to be back on the campus today. So my main research area is popular nationalism and foreign policy. So what I mean by popular nationalism is it's a kind of state in which the majority of citizens within the state have sentiments of, nationalistic, some sort of like nationalistic sentiments. So my research looks at the relationship between popular nationalism and foreign policy, both at the micro and state levels. So at the micro levels, I examine how nationalist sentiments influence citizens' foreign policy attitude. So this research actually was motivated by what happened between China and Japan in 2012 after the Japanese government announced the nationalization of disputed islands in the East China Sea. There was a huge nationalist protest across China, and Chinese citizens displayed strong nationalistic sentiments like feelings of superiority and then hostile feelings toward Japan. And previous research provides very little insights like what the consequences of having those kinds of nationalistic sentiments are. So my research builds on like studies in social psychology and explore how these sentiments form various psychological biases. So for example, like when people have feelings of superiority, like national superiority, people also tend to believe that their country is strong enough to win in a conflict or crisis with other countries. And the kind of positive illusion about one's own nation state often leads to a preference for violence or hawkish approach in foreign policy. And at the same time, national sentiments can also generate like preference for complete victory in international crisis, and also induce like uncompromising attitude. So this is somehow related to like what Katrin says. So that's why like we typically believe that like leaders' hands are tied when they have nationalistic public hope. I explored this micro foundation in the first part of my project, and building upon that, in the second part, I examined how popular nationalism actually influences leaders' decision to initiate like war, interstate war. So I agree with Katrin, that at the low level disputes, popular nationalism can increase the chance of escalation. But when it comes to actual interstate war, I don't believe that popular nationalism is actually a major cause of interstate war. There are two reasons for that. Like first, so the nature of popular nationalism suggests that if leaders are pushed toward a conflict because of popular nationalism, they have to win that war. Because political stakes are so high, and nationalism is often tied to political legitimacy. So if leaders lose that war, then it will be a total disaster. So for example, between Taiwan and China, what if Chinese leader lose a war over Taiwan? The same thing for the South Korea and Japan relations. What if South Korean president lose a war over Dokdo Islands? That will be a total disaster for political leaders. So there is really high stake for a nationalist war. So my claim is that leaders want to jump into such a nationalist war only when they have strong belief that they can win the war. But as you know, having full confidence in winning is very difficult. So that can play a role at the very fact that estimating on winning is hard can play a restraining role for leaders. And secondly, we often forget that leaders have some means to cool down popular nationalism. In authoritarian regimes, they have media control, and then also they have repressive means to deploy. And usually, people think that democratic regimes do not have such a tool, but in many cases, like democratic leaders have also some room for maneuver. So they can usually like influence over the media, or they can set up like different like domestic agendas so that they can divert public attention to different agendas at the moment. So it's conventional wisdom that nationalism pushes like leaders into more hostile reaction and into war, but my book project is trying to point out that that is actually very, very rare if we look at history. So my takeaway for you guys about like what's going on between South Korea and Japan is, and also like Japan and China, is that probably in the future, popular nationalism is unlikely to be a driving force of war between these nations. And yes, you can like fan like escalation of like low-level disputes, but it's very, very unlikely that popular nationalism to be a cause of interstate war in the region. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, and our next speaker is Peter Scott. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you for having me. So I also come from a somewhat different academic background and got into sort of the area of Korea maybe almost accidentally. I'm a computer scientist. My postdoctoral research at the University of Michigan has been in computer security. And I taught a variety of computer science classes at Pyongyang University of Science and Technology in the falls of 2013, 2014, and 2015. And so the core of my work is sort of technical network measurement and understanding online censorship and information controls. So trying to understand how quickly we can learn what content is being taught where, and if from policy changes you can quickly learn that hasn't changed. It turns out that that's not actually particularly useful in the North Korea context. There's very minimal content censorship technically, and the access limits or the information controls are primarily implemented sort of societally in terms of who has access to a computer, who has access to a computer that's connected to the internet. And that's actually true in many of the most repressive places that we see. That there's not necessarily a strong technical censorship. There's rather society. So rather than go like too deep into how network measurement systems work, I'm going to try and push this more up toward the Korea side and talk a little bit about what life is like at Boost, and then a little bit about sort of what we got. I think the two high-level metrics that are maybe most interesting to look at, one is trying to understand technical capacity and how North Korea, where it sees its limitations and how quickly it's investing to build up internal capacity technically. And the other one is how that internal technology is providing an individual sphere that hasn't existed, that people have personal ownership of smartphones and tablets, that gives them a place for personal photos, that's giving them some additional flexibility to move. And so being able to understand how much of that's real and how that balances with increased surveillance and that interplay is going to be important to understand if there's a change in dynamic and if there's any change in population dynamics. So 2013 was sort of the first Ariron smartphone had just come out in Pyongyang. So when we were there, we would see on the street occasionally people with smartphones, but it was quite uncommon. And in contrast, by 2015, pretty much every student had a tablet with them. Almost everyone you saw walking around Pyongyang had a smartphone. The city changed in those 2 years. Most of those devices were coming from Chinese OEMs and were getting sold in the country. And that came with it, this real need of, now we've got these devices, but there needs to be software on them and it needs to be vetted. And so within Boost, the one of the major things that we were getting from the administration was we needed to be training the computer science students in writing and understanding Android applications, both to be able to take Chinese or other Android applications and change them so that they would be appropriate for the local market, or to develop their own. The other main priority that was happening in those 2 years was there was this interest in cloud and how they were going to build sort of a larger technical infrastructure. So what were these technologies that would help to allow for an expansion or a consolidation and processing of data? Both of those being really internally focused on their consumer market. I think in broad strokes, that was where our students were ending up. It was not in an externally facing role, but rather domestically. That said, there's a bunch of limitations that they were facing. A lot of this is coming from constraints that were within society. So the school was quite closed off, and so it's really hard to be doing research in cloud computing when the students don't have access to a cloud or any external resources. So you know, the teachers had access to the internet, but the students were quite constrained, and we had a lot of trouble getting them really more than a single rack of computers and an internal thing that could simulate, but they weren't really able to scale in a meaningful way. The other side of that is that there continue to be power distribution issues. There will be quite a bit of time where the power will be out, maybe a quarter to a third of the time. And going back to my research, one of the things that you actually are able to do is power outages allow you to correlate when the North Korean IP space goes down to a power outage. You also see a lot of Chinese IPs that go down at the same time, and you can use this to learn the additional network presence that North Korea has, but is not advertising fully. And maybe as a commentary, that's also a reason why you would expect that North Korean cyber attacks are not coming from within the country, that these attacks that require relatively tight timing, given an unstable power and internet infrastructure domestically, you'd much rather have happen someplace with a more stable infrastructure. I guess the other thing that I can say is in the last couple of years since I've been out of the country, I continue to look at devices and the software artifacts that are coming out that are being developed for the internal consumer technology. One of those things that I think is really an interesting commentary on how much resources are going into this is looking at the textbooks that they're translating and making available within their curriculums. So I think it was at the end of 2017, I released something like 200 or 300 computer science textbooks from the internal North Korean market. And one of the things that's really interesting there is they've been translated into Korean primarily from English language textbooks, all within a year of publication. So there's significant capacity in technical translation that's happening in-house and this was from about 2002 to 2012, where they have the capacity to take at least a couple quite technical computer science textbooks and get them translated to the training internally on. And I think we don't necessarily give enough credit for that capacity. So I think we call it there.
Thank you. And last but not least, speaker is Benjamin Young. I think you can present in Korean.
Oh no, I mean, I'm severely jet lagged, so I don't think you want me to do that. So thank you for having us here, Kim. And so currently I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the U.S. Naval War College, but I'm actually moving next week with my girlfriend to South Dakota. I'm beginning a new job at Dakota State University. So I think I'm going to be the only Korea scholar in the entire state of South Dakota or North Dakota. Has anybody ever been to South Dakota? I recognize you. So I'm excited to be in Seoul, and before I go to a place where I think one neighborhood in Seoul has more people than the entire population of South Dakota. So, but my research, I'm finishing up a book on North Korea's relations with the Third World during the Cold War era. So I'm a trade historian but I'm kind of slowly becoming a political scientist, going to the dark side right there. And so my basic argument is that third worldism has been part of North Korea's national identity. And what I mean by third worldism is commitment to anti-imperialism and a belief that self-reliance and should be the core of your identity. And I use sources from all around the world, Russian sources, South Korean diplomatic sources, US diplomatic wires, Romanian diplomatic archival documents, Polish, Swedish. I've even done some interviews with African students who studied in North Korea. And what I really try to get at is, what does North Korea mean to you, being from the non-Western world? And they have a very different conception of North Korea, especially during the Cold War era. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that North Korea was ahead of South Korean economic development up until about the mid-1970s. And the three things that they really thought North Korea was great at was social control, rapid industrialization, and regimentation. So if you're a third world country and you've dealt with violence from the colonial period and you have a leader who's autocratic, if you're looking for models, North Korea actually looks pretty decent. And North Korea really capitalized on this. So they sent actual large amounts of aid to third world countries. They built statues in African countries. They built schools. They sent works of Kim Il-sung to countries. They even put advertisements in African newspapers, for example. And so I have some really interesting anecdotes in my upcoming book about how third world peoples would sometimes use North Korean enthusiasm against North Korea, and so they would just swindle North Korea. They would just take their money. And sometimes North Korea, just due to the fact that it's relatively isolated, they didn't know this, and so North Korea spent large amounts of money on lobbying efforts in the third world. One estimate says they spent more than $100 million by 1982 on lobbying efforts in the third world. So I'll just give you one brief case study so that we can open up for discussion. Has everybody heard of the mass games in North Korea? The huge choreography? So they actually exported that to the third world. So there were mass games in Somalia, there are mass games in Idi Amin's Uganda, there are mass games in Togo, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and actually still are going on in Zimbabwe. But the mass games are really a form of North Korean soft power. So we always think of South Korea as an export of soft power, Hallyu and K-pop and all that. But in some respects, Kim Il-sung was actually the originator of this kind of Korean soft power. It's just, instead of BTS, you get the mass games. It's just a different way of looking at North Korea. And this kind of model of North Korea as being a developmental example is no longer available, but a lot of these countries still maintain ties with North Korea. And I think a lot of this is based on historical experiences, solidarity, and you can't just cut these ties off with sanctions. I think there is some really deeply rooted historical linkages there, and I don't think the U.S. government understands that, and I don't think the South Korean government understands that as well. So that's kind of the general synopsis of my research.
Thank you, Benjamin. Okay, now we have listened to all of those 5 speakers. If I may, let me introduce their counterparts, if I may. We have some new PhDs starting from Dr. Soon Lee here at GSIS, and Dr. Min Sung Kim at Ilmin International Relations Institute, and Dr. Sung Kyung Choi at University of North Korean Studies. Anybody else's? Okay, and we have some PhD candidates. My former student, Hyungjin Hyun at University of Chicago, kind of an academic rival of Georgetown, and many others, the KU, GSIS, PhD students and the graduate students, undergraduate students, all of them over here. So you are free to choose any questions to the speakers. Okay, now floor is open. So if I may, let me give the first opportunity to those counterparts of our, Dr. Lee? Yeah.
Morning. My name is Su-Hung Lee. I'm a research professor at the IS Division of International Studies. So, Canada techniques. So, my specific focus on my study is the American foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy during the Jerusalem push. Professor Victor Shah was part of it, and especially on the 9/11 and the war, how the decisions were made to pushing his cabinet on terror. And in that regard, I think Dr. Shinoku has similar studies using the national sentiment and the leadership of the president. So, according to my research, I'm looking at the executive dominance in foreign policy. So, during the international environment is at risk for American international setting, the pendulum of power swings to the White House, the president. And when there is a peace, the pendulum swings back to the Congress. And that's the theory of many scholars before who made their research on the George W. Bush and his cabinet. And in that regard, there are some bureaucratic and organization process where the decisions are made. So the cabinet and also the EP and also including the scholar academia like Victor Cha was part of it. So when these are made, I think there are different variables into it, and one of them is this national sentiment, right? So after 9/11, American citizens and their hatred and their fear against Al-Qaeda was too high, where I believe during 2001, the voting and the popular rate for the George W. Bush was above 94%, and that actually gave the drive to George W. Bush to engage war on terror. That's what I believe in my research. And in that regard, how do you assess the cognitive way, the method for the George W. Bush in that regard? I'm sure there is some psychological stuff in it where he's making decisions and how those psychological decisions are made. And to do that, you will have to assess the personal character of George W. Bush. So in between the national sentiment, how he becomes the drive for the George W. Bush, I think there needs to be another variable that will need to be taken care of, where George W. Bush should be assessed in his character and how he was raised from the very beginning of his political career, where he started from George H.W. Bush's campaign, and how he was built up as a politician, and how he became who he was during 9/11/2001. So do you take that variable into your research when you look at national sentiment and how it became a drive for George W. Bush making his decision on the war on terror? So if that is a part of your research, I want your feedback or suggestion on how you do and conduct your research. Thank you very much.
Maybe that question is directed to Dr. Katz, right? Okay, leave it that way, and I will collect some questions. Dr. Choi, do you have any comments or questions? Yeah, why don't you turn on the microphone? Yes. Come closer to the microphone.
I'm doing enough interviews with Muslim refugees who have used those cell phones. And my question is how the usage of cell phones and including the smartphone. This is impacting on the social relations and the change of the everyday lives.
If I add to that, how do you assess the impact of, the cell phones on the life of the people on the border area? I don't think it is not that meaningful to talk about Pyongyang citizens, quote unquote, special people. Okay, we need to discuss the impact upon the people in the border area or outside Pyongyang area. Okay. Lisa?
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Min-Sung Kim from the Lumen International Relations Institute. I have questions related to Dr. Katz and Dr. Kyo's comments related to the current Japan-ROK relations. Especially, I want to hear some details about the Dr. Katz solutions to de-escalate these tensions. Symbolic concessions can be a temporary remedy, right, for the long-term measures, so we can get another conflict pattern sooner or later. But right now, we need at least those kinds of measures. People say in Korea nowadays, this is the period like the second movement, independent movement nowadays. It's getting worse and worse. And it seems really hard, as you mentioned. ROK has its general election next year. Abe administration also stick to their domestic politics. Even after the election victory, the Abe administration and with the internal government ranking officials try to revise his constitution, and absolutely it would make the situation worse and more complicated. Although there have been some understandings, as you mentioned, that how the economy and politics in Northeast Asia is getting more blurry. South Korea also has the previous experience about SAD issue a few years ago, linkage between the security politics and economy. We also have some kind of economic damage from Chinese economic measures at the time. So, anyway, all the related countries are trying to make the negotiation framework or hold this political environment as a symmetrical structure parallel for each other. So, even South Korea nowadays, the raised issue of Jusonia recently. So, as I mentioned, that all related countries seem to their domestic concerns much more encompassed than before. So, what can be your specific suggestions as a symbolic concession to de-escalate the tension or dispute between South Korea and Japan right now? And the 2020 Tokyo Olympic can be one of them. And the second one is, what can be the U.S. role in easing the tensions right now? Does President Trump has at least the willingness to do something or engage in this issue? And maybe this can be related to the Dr. Ko's mention about populist nationalism, which can lead the interstate war. That sounds like noble a few years ago, but nowadays I think we can be realistic. And my other question is based on my personal interest about the cyber security issues related to North Korea. Personally, I'm pretty much interested in the cyber mercenaries in the cybersecurity issues. Do you have any information about cyber mercenaries recruited by North Korea nowadays, working in the real cyberspace? If you have any, maybe there can be a bit of information on this.
Okay. I think her question are directed to three of you, NextGen scholars. Okay. Let me start with Dr. Katz for answers or comments.
Yeah, well, thank you for these very good questions and comments, things that I've thought about as well, and don't have complete answers to yet, but I'll give you some thoughts that I have on these issues. One, on the question of leadership and the role of leaders, it's a really good one. It's, I don't know, to use academic speak, a levels of analysis issue, right? I think it's always important to consider all the levels of analysis and the roles that they're playing, from structural to state level to domestic level, and as you mentioned, the very important role of individual leaders. of course plays a role in cycles of contention. For my own work, and even in the most recent round, there's a lot of comments on how this is a perfect storm because look at Moon's background, President Moon's background, and Prime Minister Abe's background. The depressing thing about that for me is that, well, we have to sit this out then until these leaders are no longer in office, and that's a really long time given the pace of things. So it doesn't give you much agency to act and to do something other than changing leadership, which these are democracies, that's not necessarily right. It could happen, but it's likely to happen, right? I do think it has an impact, but in my own work, I look at the same leaders having different stances on nationalist issues, stoking up nationalism and then not. Lee Myung-bak, towards the end of his term, stoking up the Dokdo issue very visibly. The general pattern within Korea is by the end of a term, going kind of using the anti-Japan card quite a lot. So problematic from the standpoint of looking at it as a consistent factor, but it definitely plays a role. You can't rule it out, but I try to look at things that over time are consistent across different administrations, and you find that as well. You find similarities across different leaders acting the same way, and for me, responding to similar domestic pressures in the same way. And that's what I try to take out to show a kind of consistent factor across cases so that it might be useful for other cases in other countries and that sort of thing. So that's how I thought through it in my own work, not to discount the importance of it, but that's kind of what my findings have shown there. Very good questions and observations about hot economic cold politics. For a very quick, response to that, overall, even though that's not an optimal situation, I'd like to get back to that. I'd like to get back to the siloing of these issues. It's better if these issues, historical issues and issues tied to nationalism in these countries could become resolved in some kind of permanent way. But in the meantime, keeping security and economic issues separate has served this region quite well, has served U.S. interests quite well. Again, like always to strive to make it better, but the problem now is with the blurring of that. So I think it's always been framed as a kind of problem, and it is a problem, but that was when things were better. And now things are getting worse, and I think basically because the alternatives are pretty dark. They look like other times in history when things really, alternatives like really turning inward and kind of having more nationalist economic responses to these things. I feel like we've experienced that before in history in this region and other parts of the world. So in terms of specifics, I think for the United States, it's never been smart to really openly mediate or to try to take sides, but in the interest of getting things back to kind of their places, to try to keep security out of the current tensions. So there's some discussion around GSIS to try to keep that out of this very heated and it's almost impossible to do, but to not let that get tied up into the current economic dispute would be one thing. And for symbolic concessions, often, as you mentioned, it's events coming up that it's not creating a symbolic concession out of thin air. It's kind of awkward and weird, and I don't know how you would necessarily do that. But there are things on a timeline, like the Olympics, that might be too far out, but then August 15th coming up, often in those times it's things that aren't said that are important symbolically. It's, if the Japanese Prime Minister is not going to say something that would be inflammatory or says something that would be helpful, it's subtleties that can make a really big difference. Not, again, solving things, but I think the main goal right now for Korea and Japan is to stop further bad things from happening, to ease the tensions, understanding they're not going to go away anytime quickly, and to look out for opportunities to do that.
Okay, Dr. Go.
Thank you for really insightful questions. So I'd like to second what Katrin said about the importance of leaders' individual characteristics and then their background. So I think 9/11 is a kind of exceptional case that popular nationalism actually leads to a war. But I think what my project and what I'm arguing in the project is that in those rare cases, usually the public national assignments can push leaders into war because there's relatively, high chance that leaders can have like accurate assessment. So in the case of like Iraq and Afghanistan war, like I'm pretty sure that like President Bush was very confident about the U.S. chance of winning in those wars. So I think that positive assessment was combined with Bush's nationalistic tendency plus popular nationalism at the time, and then the decision to go to war, I think, was a combination of those three different factors. Situations seem to be changing nowadays, and then my argument is based on the continued presence, the strong presence of the U.S. in the East Asian regions, because the U.S. is in the region, it makes it hard for China to accurately like assess its real chance of like getting back to Taiwan, for example, or winning a conflict with Japan over Diaoyu and Senkaku Islands. But as we are aware, like the U.S., it seems like U.S. is slowly like changing its position from like deep engagement to isolationism. So that leaves a possibility that like in the future, U.S. can try to like reduce its military presence in the region. And I think if that happens, then popular nationalism can be more dangerous than now. And then because that leaves like national leaders some more confidence that they can like take over, like for example, like islands by force, and then that will dramatically like increase their political legitimacy at home because of popular nationalism. So if that happens, then I think popular nationalism can contribute to war.
Okay. Yourself?
Sure. So on the role of cell phones, I guess there's sort of two things that I would point to in terms of how I've seen cell phones changing daily life. One is towards efficiency. So if you were trying to interact with some other work unit, or even scheduling going somewhere else, that's all going to be a cell phone call at this point, right? That's not, you don't have to worry about landlines, it's just a level of efficiency. You also hear that before, because of sort of the formalities of making a request, if you've got the person who has to make the request being in a superior rank to the person they're requesting from, they can potentially lose face in doing so. And so now cell phones provide these back doors where you can trigger the request to be made formally in the other direction, and sort of bypass some of these potentially awkward situations. So you would call your friend who's at the other workplace, your boss, and so on, call us to get started. It also, I think, gets used on a personal level for staying in contact with college friends, with previous things, and so there's this stronger network that can retain compared to you really, in North Korea, you live with your work unit. Like, you aren't going to see your college friends on a daily basis. You're lucky if you do afterwards. And so having that network that can still reach now, who are spread across the city, provides just this much richer potential personal dynamic. In regards to the border area, so there's two things, right? There's smuggle phones that are on a Chinese network. That only works in a fairly limited physical space, right? The cell phone networks don't have coverage that far in. So you're talking about people who can either live or travel really quite close to the border. So that gets used for things like remuneration networks or communication as a relay, where there will be people who live in those areas who have both a phone on the internal network and on the Chinese network, and are able to act as relay points. But that's, it works in those relay situations, but that's not a part of daily life for that many people. One of the things you do see is in the markets, it's not hard to get black market or gray market phones. So there is quite a lot of technology that's happening outside of the direct government control and process. And so that's evidence of this continued value of that sort of connectivity. On the surveillance side, most of the smartphones, when you look at them, especially there was this window in 2013, 2014, where the first round of, maybe in the first couple waves of smartphones that came out, didn't have their surveillance mechanisms particularly well implemented. And so there was quite a bit of room to potentially watch movies and potentially see media on those phones without too much risk. Most of the surveillance that happens still is going to be the same risk that someone's already going to face, that it's if someone physically comes and gets your phone, they can see what you've been doing on it. In the same way that if you have other forms of smuggled media, it's going to be a similar risk. The phones in that, I mean, even in 2015, aren't really reporting back on the network. So you don't have this centralized, strong capacity that's able to track you. The tracking that you're looking at is, most of them have an uninstallable app called Trace Viewer that will record screenshots of apps and media. So if someone comes and wants to look at your phone, they can scroll back and see what you've been doing with it. So that's sort of the risk, is you get sort of this log, but it stays locally on the phone. For cyber mercenaries, I think one of the important things is understanding sort of the patronage of China in North Korean hacking and cyber activities. Ben probably also has some thoughts on this, but I mean, there's definitely been reports of technical trainings in China where North Korean nationals self-identify, and so have been invited by the Chinese government to be present and get technical capacity there. When you think about a lot of the activities, a lot of them are financially motivated. And in that case, that reconciling that with a true mercenary model starts to get sort of, there's a lot of questions that come up, which is, if these are just financial crimes, why isn't that mercenary just doing it purely for their own benefit? Why are they, so is North Korea going to pay them at that same rate? Well, that doesn't make sense for them if they're financially motivated. And so why then is the independent actor not just being independent and they get more money? So understanding that dynamic is one that is where that work is.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Now the floor is open. So raise your hand, and when you make a question or a comment, please be brief. And before you ask questions or comments, please identify yourself and please let them know, where your questions are directed to. So, any questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jenna Gibson. I'm at the University of Chicago, PhD student. My question is actually for Dr. Kim. I find it really interesting. I don't study education at all, but I'm really interested in your work. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot being here in Korea for the summer is Songdo and the international schools that have been built out there in the last 3 years. From my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, part of the motivation was to encourage more foreign students to study abroad in Korea. But from what I understand, it maybe hasn't worked exactly as they planned, or maybe it's smaller than they wanted it to eventually be. So I'm curious if you've done any research on that specifically.
I will collect some questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Taylor. I'm a graduate student at GSIS. This is for Dr. Katz. I was just wondering what role you see China playing in current Japan-Korea issues, if they're going to be a responsible stakeholder in the region and try to downplay it or soothe the tensions, or if they're going to try to exploit the tensions between these two sides.
Interesting. Role of China, not U.S. Hyungjun.
Hi, I'm Hyungjun from the University of Chicago. I have a question for Professor Ko. It's always a pleasure to hear about your ongoing research. So I wanted to ask you a question. So your research essentially proposes a conditional hypothesis where nationalism becomes a force for conflict only to the extent that leaders believe in the probability of complete or decisive victory. For me, an interesting obverse of this hypothesis is that low-level conflicts might be more likely when nationalist agitation is at lower levels, because the public is then more willing to accept partial or piecemeal victories or gains. So can you say a few words about whether you see such dynamics in your research, in your empirical investigations? One interesting counterintuitive policy implication of this is that actually leaders who are interested in managing escalation, de-escalation, who are interested in peace, might actually have an interest under some circumstances in actually stymie, bolstering nationalism, right? Is that too much of a stretch of an inference to draw from your research, or do you see actually some of these dynamics at work in your empirical investigation?
Thank you. I will take one more question for the first one. Yes. Microphone?
I can use this.
Ask your question.
I'm a master's student at KU GSIS, and I have a question for Dr. Young. My question was, what kind of relations and how strong the relations between third world countries and the North Korea have, and if the relations are strong enough, as you said, is it gonna influence the effectiveness of the sanctions against North Korea? And if that's the case, will there be any chance that North Korea just kind of abandons its efforts to build a peaceful relations with South Korea and the US and just focus on its relations, its economic or diplomatic or cultural relations with third world countries?
Okay. So I will give the floor to Stephanie Kim first, and then Katz, Cole, and Young.
Thank you so much for your question. It's actually a really great question, and I'm glad you asked. So you're right. The rationale of building a place like Songdo was to provide an infrastructure to accommodate international students. And so, the rationale is if you build it, they will come. And it was happening alongside various government policies like the Study Korea project, with the goal of getting international students studying in South Korea up to 200,000. So in terms of building up the international infrastructure, there were the English language campus settings, more EMI classes. In many cases, some of these schools have, quote unquote, imported foreign scholars from overseas to teach in English at these campuses. And I've written in my work that while it does attract international students to South Korea, what it also does in conjunction is re-attract Korean students who might already be overseas or who might otherwise go overseas from a domestic market. And I've called this phenomenon reverse student mobility. I've published a paper on it and I'm happy to share it with you. And in this sense, it forces us to think of internationalization efforts in higher education as counterintuitively anti-internationalization, because it effectively retains or reverses the flow of students across national borders, if that's how we define internationalization in higher education traditionally. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Katz?
Thank you for bringing up the role of China. I think it's a really interesting sort of part of this. I'm not sure if this was your question, but I certainly don't think China is going to try to reconcile Japan and South Korea, primarily because strategically it really likes it when Japan and South Korea see U.S. allies. The other third part of the triangle not working out is quite good strategically for China as well as North Korea. In this case, they also might benefit economically, further on down the line. There's speculation that China could be a resupplier of products that South Korea wanted from Japan. So it's a double whammy effect of not really helping things in terms of reconciliation. Interestingly, though, also right now, Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping are in a more warm phase than in the past. So that would also complicate this. They seem to be doing quite well at sitting back right now Historically, it's not been a conflict like that. And generally, South Korea and China have been on the same side of the history issues. So we've seen times in the past when the Park Geun-hye's time, for instance, when China was also fighting Japan over the same historical issues. So there's variation there, but generally, I think we wouldn't see, at least in our current world, a role to actually ease tensions because it can be quite brutal.
Thank you. Dr. Kwok?
Thank you for a really interesting question. I guess like India, Pakistan, that maybe like the one that shows like high nationalism can be correlated with like frequent like low level of conflicts. But I think even in the case, I mean, if you look at, I mean, those cases, usually these crises are driven by like private actors or like a military level initiative, not at the like leader level. So if leaders believe that there is no, I mean, high chance of like winning in a war, then it's better for them to avoid like low level conflicts. So because there is like still like a chance of escalation, and then it is more costly for leaders to cool down popular nationalism once like low level like disputes take place. So I think like at their will, like leaders are still likely to play a leaders even if leaders want to play a nationalism card, still it's very likely that they want to avoid even low level disputes if they are not confident about the chance of winning.
Okay. No?
So in regards to how North Korea treats the third world now, it's been a substantial shift. I think there's two key events that kind of signal that. Is that a few years ago, North Korean hackers stole over $100 million from the central bank of Bangladesh, and they specifically targeted Bangladesh because their security measures are weaker than a lot of developed countries. And I think it was like 2 years ago when North Korean agents helped to plan an attack on Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia's international airport with a WMD Great Merit agent. You don't do these two events to countries that you see as allies. So North Korea, they still have rhetoric that talks about solidarity with anti-imperialist countries, but there's really only a few that they still regard as allies. One is Cuba. Cuba and North Korea relations are still very strong. Venezuela, and also a couple regimes in Africa. But overall, I think North Korea now thinks of the third world as an opportunity to undermine political rivals, whether it's South Korea or whether it's internal enemies that are a threat to the ruling elite. And this shift actually really began under Kim Jong-il with the bombing in 1983 in Burma. Kim Jong-il he reversed what Kim Il-sung had a revolutionary duty to help out third world movements and third world governments. But under Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un, it's substantially different.
Okay, thank you very much. Second round, briefly. Are there any undergraduate students? Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, yes. Privilege.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor to pose a question. And I have a question for Dr. Young. And I'm majoring in cultural tourism, so I do not know like nearly any of about this field. But what made me interested was that you mentioned mass game as a cultural diplomacy. So I would like to know how North Korea is doing some cultural diplomacy towards some African countries, which are kind of corrupted, or like the third world you mentioned.
Okay. Any others? Yes.
My name is Youngjae. I'm in the master's program at the Political Science Department here at Korea University. My question is to Dr. Ko. So you mentioned the part about the cooling down effect of nationalism and how regimes, especially in authoritarian regimes, they actually use methods such as media control, which got me thinking to maybe like China and Japan in the early 2000s when there was the arson of the embassy. But in 2019, I was thinking, is this like mechanism like effective? So I was wondering what your thoughts would be on the effectiveness of this media control to cool down nationalism, and if it does really work as a cool down mechanism.
Okay. Any questions from the other side? Yes.
Nice to meet you. I'm Jun Kim. I'm in the master degrees course at GSIS. I want to ask Professor Cha. I read the Impossible State in Press Release and read the article that Professor mentioned that the talks in Panmunjom is kind of reality show. Well, I think it is a problem that the summit couldn't make any progress and has repeated certain pattern until now. In my humble opinion, it comes from a disagreement or needs. What the North Korea really wants is the survival of leaders, honestly. But the United States can give is just economic assurance. Yeah. So please let me know what you think. It could be very helpful for my class's proposal.
Okay. Is there anybody who cannot go to sleep without making any questions? Yes.
Hello, I'm also a student here at KU GSIS. I have maybe my question is directed to Dr. Katz. So, Security Council sanctions have been there since maybe North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, but I guess recent sanctions restricting North Korean exports of coal and imports of oil has more effect on North Korean economy and the regime itself. And also China's participation in the sanctions regime. So I want to hear your opinion on what the motivations of China's participation in the sanctions regime would be, and up to what degree China will participate in the regime as well.
Okay. The rear seat. Yes.
I don't have
No. You raise your hand, right? He raised it. You give up? You pass?
No, we both raised it.
Oh, okay. So, first come, first serve.
I have a question for Dr. Kim. I'm an undergraduate student at Stanford, and as a student studying abroad, international student studying abroad, I had a question of, so you mentioned how the institutions are using international students paying tuition to cover for their budget, but I'm also interested in how the United States promotes their soft power through high elite education, because I think that the United States is unparalleled in promoting sort of a high elite education by attracting students from around the globe. So I'm interested in how that sort of links to soft power.
Okay, good question. Okay, next with you.
Hi, my name is Choi Hyun-bin. I'm an undergraduate student here in Korea University. My question is, if I may, I have two questions. One is directed to Dr. Katz, and the other is directed to Dr. Scott. For Dr. Katz, I was wondering if, by my understanding, I'm not an expert, but from my studies, the conflict patterns in Northeast Asia seems to be changing because for the majority of the patterns, South Korea has been more on the anti-Japan rhetoric, but then now Japan is also turning to anti-South Korean rhetoric. I wonder if that could be part of the patterns that are changing in Northeast Asia. What are your thoughts about it? And for Dr. Scott, cybersecurity issues are becoming a very important aspect of interstate warfare, interstate conflict, and I'm not sure if you are an expert on the Korean side of things, but I was wondering if you have any knowledge, if you could explain what you think about how ready South Korea is in the case of an all-scale, hypothetically speaking, also very large-scale North Korean attack on South Korean networks.
Excellent. Okay, Dr. Young.
Alright. Very briefly, thanks for your question. So North Korea, the mass games collaboration really ended in the mid-1990s. North Korea just simply ran out of money, and they still don't really have a lot of money, and they don't really want to devote it too much to cultural diplomacy with African countries. But what they do now is they set up Juche study institutions, Juche study groups in Africa, and they use this for domestic propaganda purposes, just saying, oh, you know, our leaders are really revered around the world, blah, blah, blah. It was very, for all intents and purposes, it's pretty shallow and superficial, and sometimes they even just pay locals to come to their Juche study groups. I found some evidence of that. So right now, I mean, South Korea, its soft power is a million times greater than North Korea's. But I think there is still kind of this anti-colonial solidarity with North Korea. It is still kind of in the background, but you can't compete with BTS.
Okay, Dr. Ko?
Thank you for your question. Let me briefly illustrate like how the Chinese government used the media control in 2012. So, nationalist protests occurred like in more than 100 cities in China, but almost no Chinese newspapers posted like photos of protests. And before like popular nationalism was on the rise, the main Chinese state media covered the Aoi Senkaku issue for like 40 hours per week. But after like nationalist protests started to spread across the country, the Chinese government cut down the media coverage to up to like 5 hours per week. So that dramatically like changed the people's attention, and also at the same time, the Chinese government increased to like think about more like a natural patriotism to their citizens through their media. So yeah, that's the way that how the Chinese government controlled, and it was trying to cool down popular nationalism.
Okay. Scott?
Sure. In terms of large-scale attacks, some of this is threat model that for almost anyone who has persistent access through to another country, you get much more value out of having the surveillance and view of it than you do shutting it down. Right? Especially if your motive here is profit, not just disruption. So most people, when they're thinking about a large-scale like disruption, that happens much more from squirrels or animals than from a cyber attacker. I think, from what I've seen, South Korea is as prepared as anyone for major disruption.
So thank you for your question, and actually that's a very good point. And yes, certainly there's a soft power element to this, and so different from the institutional level, which is primarily about the bottom line. On a nation-state level, in many respects, it is about soft power. And so, from the U.S. side of it, there are programs to promote soft power via international education opportunities. The most famous of them being the Fulbright program to bring in international students to the U.S. and send U.S. students outward to countries. These programs are also very much dependent on the priorities of whatever administration is currently holding court, and unfortunately, in this current moment, that doesn't seem to be a very high priority at the moment. What I actually find quite interesting is that this soft power priority is also happening on the South Korean side. And so you see this through Korean studies funding mechanisms like the Korea Foundation, 한국국제교육문화단, and the Academy of Korean Studies, the 중앙, I forget the Korean name, 한국중앙연구원. Okay. And so these are, I find very interesting because they fund the study of Korea primarily to overseas scholars and to overseas institutions. And in many respects, you can also look at that as a form of soft power taking place on the South Korean side.
Okay, Dr. Park, briefly.
Okay, on this sanctions question, I mean, it's not directly related to my work, but it's something I thought about. I think, China, yes, was a big supporter of the maximum pressure campaign, and that was very significant. Maximum pressure, of course, still exists in terms of sanctions, but 2017 is the peak kind of cooperation phase for China. I saw this because the interest in stability, that was the least stable time in terms of dynamics with North Korea. Its enforcement of the sanctions is, its incentives to enforce them go down, maybe not doing it overtly, but go down once tensions have eased and the situation stabilizes. It's a brief, I guess, response to that. On the conflict patterns question, that's a really good insight and something that definitely problematically does seem to be true. And what it brings to mind is that the iterated patterns don't repeat the exact same way every time. It shows that over time, things actually do change internally, and in Japan, I think there has been, as you noted, increase in anti-South Korea sentiment over time because of the very repetition of many of these same disputes. My way of thinking about that, though, is that I don't see it as a particular driver of the current dynamics. It's important, but my sense is that there's still more of a relative ambivalence on the Japanese side about this issue compared to South Korea, and that if that were the only change, we wouldn't be seeing, this blurring of, broader, hot economics, cold politics. To me, the bigger driver of that change really has to do with the U.S. injecting strategic uncertainty into the region, as well as new tactics. I don't think Japan would have tried these tactics if the U.S. hadn't kind of weaponized trade in some way.
Okay. Yeah, I know. But together with your final word. Okay. Before I give the floor to Victor, Professor Ishino, do you have any word as a senior advisor for this program?
Yeah, I feel
within 30 seconds.
The professor have no chance to talk. I think I will see you guys in the dinner. We have several comments and questions, so why don't I say that so that you give a chance to talk.
Okay, Victor.
First, just to answer the question quickly, Impossible State is a great book, I've heard. Yeah. In terms of the question of security guarantees, I mean, as you know well, you can look at security guarantees as external security guarantees, which the United States has given many times to North Korea. The most recent iteration on paper was the one that George W. Bush did, which is that the United States will not attack North Korea with nuclear or conventional weapons. And they get a security assurance. But that's not the security guarantee that the regime wants. They want the internal security guarantee. And that, of course, is very difficult for any country to give. I think it would be interesting if someone did a study and looked at whether there's ever been a case in history where an autocratic leader accepted a security guarantee from a security patron, an allied patron, and was satisfied with it. Because my guess is the answer is no, because of the nature of the regime itself. I mean, just think how democratic allies never feel comfortable even with a security guarantee from an ally, like South Korea and the United States. And this is a relatively transparent relationship, so it's infinitely hard. The interesting thing about Donald Trump is that he seems to be trying to replace the notion of an internal security guarantee with the building of some sort of trust with the North Korean leader through these constant meetings and platitudes and things of that nature, which I find ironic because if there's anybody in the world that I would not trust, this is all being filmed, if there's anybody in the world that I would not trust, it would be you-know-who. So with that, first I want to thank Professor Kim, Professor Lee, and all of you for taking the time. I thought it was an excellent discussion. Your questions were really excellent, really, all of you, and this was, to me at least, certainly the highlight we've had of the past day.
Thank you, Victor. I think we have had a very interesting discussions. As we had expected, we have a really exciting session. I personally believe U.S.-Korea, Korea-U.S. relationship is like a human being who needs to be regularly fed, should be educated, and go to the hospital for regular checkup to live longer. In that sense, I'm pretty confident. U.S. Korea, U.S. NextGen scholars will contribute to making this bilateral alliance relationship to move to a better direction. So on that optimistic note, let me adjourn this session. I propose to give these excellent, NextGen scholars a big round of applause. Thank you for your active, participation and cooperation. Thank you. Photo session. This is the most important. Photo session.